Welcome to this session on the DVD on the Introduction to and Overview on the FPI Code of Ethics and Professional Responsibility. Now, before we go into the actual code, I want to give you a quote from the famous court case of Durr versus Epson, entitled, "Why Must You Know the Law?" Now, as financial planners, you are dealing with a lot of legal components. Almost every aspect has a legal component to it. Of course, not everything in investment planning or retirement planning has, but there's tax law, there's estate planning law, there's compliance, for example. Now, from this court case where the judge said, it is not negligent not to be a lawyer, but those who undertake to advise their clients on matters including an important legal component do so at their peril if they have not informed themselves sufficiently on the law. Now, this is a Supreme Court of Appeal judgment looking at what is the reasonable person test. Now, if you are a certified financial planning professional, you'll be judged as an expert in financial planning. If you are advising on things that have to do with the legal component, and remember the FPI Code of Conduct is a part of the common law of contract, it's very important for you to make sure that you know what you're talking about. This is going to be highlighted in some of the aspects from the code dealing with competence. Now, when we are talking about the FPI Code of Ethics and Professional Responsibility, we are talking about a subset of ethics called professional ethics. Now, in ethics, we have personal ethics and we have professional ethics. And some research now indicated on this slide indicates what essentially is the slight difference or overlap between professional and personal ethics. Personal ethics, we can see, includes concern for the well-being of others, respect for others, trustworthiness, honesty, being fair, refusing to take advantage of people, doing good, and preventing harm. However, when we're looking at professional ethics, we are looking at how you are acting as a professional in your field of specialization. And some of the aspects here you'll see are common throughout the FPI Code of Ethics, as well as the CFA Code of Ethics, FISA Code of Ethics. In fact, every professional body will have a Code of Ethics which will highlight these very issues. Now, these issues are impartiality and objectivity, openness and full disclosure, confidentiality, due diligence and a duty of care to your clients, fidelity to professional responsibilities, and avoiding potential or apparent conflicts of interest. Now, as we can see, the FAIS Code of Conduct also deals with some of these items, such as disclosure, confidentiality, conflicts of interest. The difference between the FAIS Code and the FPI Code of Ethics and Professional Responsibility is that FAIS operates in a more limited context of financial products, where the FPI Code of Ethics will apply to any CFP professional operating in any aspect of financial planning, whether or not financial products are involved. Thus, it could relate to tax advice, to advice on a will or a trust, which does not fall under the FAIS Code of Conduct. Now, because we're talking about the FPI Code of Ethics, I want to just talk about how do you certify to become a certified financial planning professional. Now, we have these things called the 4 E's, which, as you well know, are ethics, experience, exam, and education. Now, for the most part, these are once-off items that you'll prove competency in. For example, you write the board exam, you'll get your postgraduate diploma or BCom honors in financial planning. Now, what does it mean certifying for once-off or for the rest of your career? Now, you must certify at renewal stage every year that you are adhering to the FPI Code of Ethics and Professional Responsibility. Furthermore, the requirements of continued professional development then take over. Now, just because you've written one exam to prove yourself competent does not mean you'll remain competent for the rest of your life. We have things in the financial services environment which are subject to constant change and flux. Certain laws, economic environment, product development, and CPD in this way is almost more important than the initial once-off certification that you did in order to ensure that you remain competent, updated, and keep your expert speciality knowledge intact in order to be able to advise your clients properly. Now, let's look at the outline of the FPI Code of Ethics and Professional Responsibility. The code comprises of 3 aspects. The principles of conduct, these relate to qualities that a member should aspire to having and general behavior. Then we have standards of conduct. Now, these are how professional members should direct their conduct. These are more rules-based in the code. And lastly, we'll have the financial planning practice standards. This includes the 6-step financial planning process, along with how they are unpacked in what has been called the financial planning practice standards. Now, all these three items are interdependent and interlinked. We have rules, we have practice standards, and we have principles. You cannot look at any one item on their own, and you need to take into account, of course, member regulations and the disciplinary regulations, all of which are available on the FPI's website, fpi.co.za. Now, if we look at this next slide, really it's just a blank road going through some clouds. I've used this to illustrate what is the practice that a financial planner is going to do. Now, we have a client that you will see, and you will follow the 6-step financial planning process repeatedly with every client for the rest of your career. Now, not every client is going to require you to do all 6 steps of the financial planning process. And once somebody is already a client, then you are not going to go back and continue redo every single step. You may just do what requires in terms of the review. Now, the journey of the financial life cycle of a client and the life cycle of the client-planner relationship is very important. Now, these practice standards, the rules and the standards are all there to guide you on this particular journey. During this journey, you will encounter some pitfalls during the relationship. For example, what happens where there's a conflict of interest, where suitability issues may arise on financial products relating to a client, or certain restrictions that may arise in terms of law. Now, there's a number of pitfalls that may occur. Now, the point of the Code of Ethics and Professional Responsibility and the practice standards is to ensure that you have a guide for best practice so that you can avoid these pitfalls. Now, this code will enumerate certain practices through the principles, through the standards, or the practice standards and the 6-step financial planning process, illustrating these are potential pitfalls. However, if you follow aspects from the code, you will have best practice guidelines in order to not fall into those pitfalls, so you can navigate the road and the journey ethically without any problems. Let's move on to unpacking and going through an overview, at least, of the 8 principles of conduct. Now, as I mentioned, these are principles based compared to the rules that we have, which are the standards of conduct. Being principles, their scope is very wide. It talks to your behavior in general as a professional, not specific things that you should or should not do. Now, the fact that they are principles means that these are ideal standards against which your behavior and conduct can be assessed and benchmarked against. This means that these principles set a very high standard for your conduct as a CFP professional. Let's look at the first principle, client first. Placing the client's interest first is a hallmark of professionalism, requiring professional members to act honestly and not place personal and/or employer gain or advantage, economic or otherwise, before the client's interests. Now, this principle, the client first, is also known as the fiduciary standard. This is the highest standard known in law since Roman Dutch law for how to behave in a fiduciary capacity, whether you're a director, whether you're a trustee, or in this case also a financial planner. This means the client must come first. Now, as we can see, the whole Code of Ethics and Professional Responsibility, if it boiled down to just one principle, it would be this: put your client first. This means acting in the best interest of your client. Now, when we're talking about the fiduciary standard, this is a very high standard against which your conduct and behavior will be assessed and benchmarked against, relating to principles that are expounded in our common law, for example, through De versus Epson, which will look at, do you hold yourself out to be an expert or a professional? If you do, you will be held to a higher standard of accountability and responsibility. The next principle, integrity. Now, as you see, there's an overlap between client first and integrity and objectivity. The fact that these 8 principles, which are aligned so closely together and do overlap, ensures that every type of professional behavior is covered. Now, integrity demands honesty and candor, which must not be subordinated to personal gain and advantage. CFP professionals are placed in positions of trust by clients, and the ultimate source of that trust is the CFP professional's personal integrity. Allowance can be made for innocent error and legitimate differences of opinion, but integrity cannot coexist with deceit or subordination of one's principles. In terms of professional integrity, this means upholding a role with extreme seriousness and the role that you're playing in your clients' lives and in the financial services sector in general. Our next principle, objectivity. Objectivity requires intellectual honesty and impartiality. Regardless of the particular services rendered or the capacity in which a CFP professional functions or operates, CFP professionals should protect the integrity of their work, maintain objectivity, and avoid subordination of their judgment. Our next principle is competence. Of course, this is one of the most important aspects about being a technical professional, for example, like a CFP professional. Not only is it how you act, you can be trustworthy, you can be honest, but you have to know what you are talking about. This is the principle of competence, which means attaining and, as I've mentioned, maintaining an adequate level of knowledge and skill, and the application of that knowledge and skill in providing services and advice to clients. Competence also includes the wisdom to recognize the limitations of that knowledge and know when consultation with other professionals is appropriate, or referrals to other professionals may be necessary. CFP professionals make a continuing commitment to learning and professional development. You do this through by getting CPD points, which include technical knowledge, includes practice standards, which includes building your business, sales training, and of course, ethics training. Now, this area of competence, this is one of the hallmarks of what makes the CFP professional, that you are an expert in financial planning in the specialization that you are practicing, whether you are an investment practitioner or an estates and trust practitioner or a tax practitioner. The next principle is fairness. Fairness requires impartiality, intellectual honesty, and disclosure of material conflicts of interest. It involves the subordination of one's own feelings, prejudices, and desires so as to achieve a proper balance of conflicting interests. Fairness is treating others in the same fashion that you would like to be treated. The next principle, confidentiality. This means ensuring that information is accessible only to those authorized to have access. A relationship of trust and confidence with the client can only be built upon the understanding that the client's information will remain confidential. There may be many situations where you feel you are keeping to the principle of confidentiality, but in fact you are misusing or abusing this principle. Think about the fact that when you have a couple as a client, and you have a husband and a wife, or any particular two partners together, whose information belongs to whom? Do you regard each spouse's utterances as that spouse's only? What about if you're dealing with other members of the family, parents or children or brothers or sisters, business partners? It is essential that confidentiality must be maintained at client level, and under no circumstances should you as a professional violate your client's sense of trust in you in this regard. Our second to last point, professionalism. This requires behaving with dignity and courtesy to clients, fellow professionals, and others in business-related activities. CFP professionals cooperate with other fellow CFP professionals to enhance and maintain the profession's public image and improve the quality of services. This means that as a professional, it is up to you to try help and maintain and improve the standard and the reputation of our industry. FPI's came into being barely 10 years ago as a result of perhaps decades of unscrupulous activities by a small number of advisors. As a professional, when you are interacting with your clients, you can change their mindset about their financial planning profession. And when every CFP professional can do this, then we can start to truly transform our industry. Our very last principle is diligence. Now, diligence is the provision of services in a reasonably prompt and thorough manner, including the proper planning for and supervision of the rendering of financial services. Our diligence includes, of course, competence, providing due diligence on investments or products for their clients to ensure that the products are at least meeting the suitability standard, but ideally should be in the best interest of your clients. All of this should be taken into context of the fiduciary standard. What does it mean to put your clients first in all aspects? Now, the second pillar of the FPI Code of Ethics and Professional Responsibility is the 10 Standards of Conduct. Now, having just looked at the 8 principles of conduct, you can see and understand they intuitively respond to things that you as a professional generally do, attitudes that you try pervade to clients. Now we are talking about rules. Now, these 10 standards are rules-based. This means that you can't intuitively understand them. You have to sit down and read them. Now, let's go through these 10 briefly. The first of the 10 standards, relationship with clients and prospects. You will naturally see some overlap between the standards and the rules and the principles. This is inevitable in a professional code of conduct, where we are talking about basic principles and how specific conduct should be applied. Now, this principle has duty of care, the client professional member agreement, which states, for example, that you must have a written agreement with the client, and this written agreement must state certain objectives. Complaints, that it deals with how you handle complaints. Confidentiality, which we've seen before as a principle, now it's specific about specific rules on confidentiality. Termination of the relationship between you and your client. Lending and borrowing of monies between yourself and clients and family members, and how that may be done and dealt with in terms of the code. And lastly, acting within your scope of competence. This is very important as a professional, that you only act in the field that you are competent in. Now, even if you are active in the investment field, you may not be competent on every aspect of investments or every type of investment vehicle or product. If you are unsure about anything, you must seek professional assistance from a fellow CFP professional or any other expert to help assist your client, to make sure that they're in a position where their needs are met first. The second standard is promotion of services. And this standard states that professional members should not provide false or misleading information to clients or engage in fraudulent activities. Now, of course, if it's against the law, any particular piece of legislation in financial services will make sure that that behavior is prohibited. This goes an extra measure to ensure that even if that behavior is not in the financial services sector, but it's dealing with clients, then that behavior is regulated. The next principle is then remuneration. The common disclosure principles to ensure that commission and or fees are fully explained to the client, what they are going to pay, how they are going to pay it. That remuneration should be fair, that you should be paid for your skill and for your time. And this almost goes against what some of the principles of commission are about, where you are then being paid to sell the product and not for your skill or the time involved. And lastly, your advice should not be tainted by dishonest gain. Our next standard is disclosures. Now, some of these are vitally important, which are not dealt with in other parts of phase, for example. High risk and high return investments. This means you have to be particularly diligent when you encounter a situation, which of course is usually too good to be true, of high risk investments and high return investments. You as a professional looking at the principles of diligence and of competence must ensure that if there are higher than expected risk, your client is aware of it. If returns are higher than expected compared to an average return on a similar financial instrument or product, you must look at the due diligence to how these returns are being generated. And of course, if there's higher returns and higher risk instruments also pay higher commission or higher fees, that's something equally to pay attention to. Now, tax concessions is the next point in the FPI code on disclosures. This principle ensures that your planning is not too tax aggressive. If there's a material scheme in your plan, which could be a financial plan based on wills or retirement annuities, for example, and the material element of that plan hinges upon one particular tax law, if that law changes, the client's financial plan may not be worth anything. This principle will guard against aggressive financial planning in the form of exploiting tax loopholes to minimize a specific tax. Always look at the broader objectives for estate planning or financial planning. And lastly, FPI status. This is to ensure that you disclose to your clients that you are a CFP professional, that your conduct can be reported to and complaints dealt with, but also that your clients know that you belong to a professional body and that you adhere to a professional code of ethics. Our next standard is fiduciary responsibilities. This word fiduciary here does not necessarily relate to the earlier use of fiduciary, which means acting in the best interest of clients. This talks about fiduciary in the sense of looking after the assets for clients. And so this specifically we're talking about treatment of client funds or client assets, which you are looking after for and on behalf of your clients. And of course, you must act in the best interest of your clients, and you must protect these items that you are a fiduciary over. The next standard, duty to employers. This standard will talk about what duties you as a CEP professional will have to your employers that you are working in, which could be a financial planning organization, an employee benefits or healthcare type of organization. The same duties will apply. And the next point is preventing violations. If you are acting in a management or supervisory capacity, you must ensure that people under your supervision are complying to the code. If there are violations that you detect, you must seek to prevent them and report them under this code. Our third last standard, conflict of interest. Now, this standard seeks to ensure that you make full and fair disclosure of all matters which are relevant to clients. Now, phase also talks about conflicts of interest, and it's got some definitions in the General Code of Conduct for FSPs and authorized representatives. Now, that is, of course, vitally important. That's a minimum standard as per the law, and typically that kind of conflict of interest will relate to where financial products are involved. This type of conflict, recognized by the code, goes a lot broader than this. Now, of course, even though this is just one line and a few words on this slide, you must make sure that you read and unpack the full detail in the actual FPI Code of Ethics, which you either could have done as pre-reading to watching this DVD or as post-reading. Please ensure that you read the code. The next standard, responsibilities to the FPI. The previous standards we have looked at deal with how you interact with and relate to clients and their property. This one and the next one, these standards deal with your responsibilities as a professional member of the Financial Planning Institute of Southern Africa. In terms of this, you have to adhere to the renewal requirements set from time to time. You must ensure that you adhere to the FPI Code of Ethics and Professional Responsibility. And you must ensure that you do not represent the FPI. This means, as a CEP professional, you may have an opinion. You may appear on talk shows, you may appear on websites or on radio shows, but you cannot represent the official opinion of the FPI without prior authorization to do so. And you need to ensure that you can distinguish between your own opinion as a professional versus a professional who's representing the professional body. And our final standard, you are obligated to comply with the continuous professional development requirements set down from time to time by the FPI. Falsifying your CPD points is a contravention of the code. It's also not acting with professionalism and integrity. And as a result, your membership could be suspended if you fail to get the CPD points, or if you lie about getting points, then you could have your membership revoked completely. And that will affect your career under the honesty and integrity requirements that the FASE Act espouses. Now we're looking at the last pillar of the FPI Code of Ethics and Professional Responsibilities, which is the 6-step process and the financial planning practice standards. Now, the practice standards are procedural prudence in how to exercise your day-to-day functions as a financial planner. The principles and the standards that we've looked at talk about general conduct. This is the first time we looked at how you should do your job as a financial planner. Now we have 6 steps, and in these 6 steps, they are unpacked into 15 practice standards. Now, these 6 steps, which of course you're all familiar with. Step 1, establishing and defining the relationship with the client. Now, as we can see, there are 3 financial planning practice standards which are attached to this step of the financial planning process. Now, for example, these talk about informing the client about financial planning and the professional's competencies. Now, you can easily take this back to the principles and the standards which talk about competence and various disclosures and acting within your competence. Next, determining whether the financial planning professional can meet the client's needs. Again, can your competence match what the client needs? Once you match these two up, you will then define the scope of the engagement, which must be, in terms of the standards, a written agreement between you and your client. The next step, collecting the client's information. You see, this unpacks into 3 separate practice standards, looking at qualitative and quantitative information. Then we're going to analyzing and assessing the client's financial status. Now we're analyzing the client's information and assessing the client's objectives, their needs, and their priorities. Step 4, developing and presenting the recommendations to the client. We're looking at identifying what the recommendations are, which products you're going to use, which strategies you're going to employ in terms of estate planning or investment planning or tax planning. Once you've decided on these strategies and these products, you're then going to go to step 5, implementing these products and these recommendations. You will agree on the responsibilities for implementation. Who will take responsibility for making sure the client has a will, for example. And lastly, once you've implemented the financial plan, to ensure that there's provisions in place to monitor and review the financial plan. It could be biannually or once a year, depending on what the client wants. Looking at what are the responsibilities between you and your client, what situations will trigger a review. For example, could be a client being retrenched, retired, someone getting married, someone dying. And looking at what process are you going to use to review the client situation. Now, the same process should be used in terms of reviewing and as well as in analyzing. Now, if we look at why these practice standards were developed, and they were developed by the Financial Planning Standards Board, which is the international body that governs the CFP mark, of which FPI is an affiliate. These standards of practice will establish the level of practice expected of a professional engaged in delivering financial planning services to a client. They will establish norms of professional practice and allow for consistent delivery of financial planning by CFP professionals. And that's a very important part. The experience that a client gets from going to one CFP professional should be similar to the experience the client gets going to another CFP professional. You may have your own processes and your internal modes of communication, but the financial planning process should be standard. These practice standards will also help to clarify the roles and responsibilities of the financial planner and their clients and other people involved in the engagement. For example, a tax specialist, a wills drafter, or a trust specialist, or even a fund manager in executing an investment mandate. And lastly, they are there to enhance the value of the financial planning process. That we're not just giving you 6 skeleton steps, but rather more detailed breakdown as to how to use those steps to fulfill your functions as a fiduciary financial planner. Thank you for watching this short DVD of an introduction to and overview of the FPI Code of Ethics and Professional Responsibility. The objectives and the outcomes of this DVD are for you to ensure that you have a broad understanding of the principles and the standards and the process that the code talks about. Of course, subsequent training will allow you to go into much more detail on any specific point. Now, this code of ethics can be a bit theoretical. The point of how to actually introduce it into your daily practice and contextualize these principles will be enumerated upon in a series of seminars in July around the country on ethics and the FPI code. This session is entitled Practical Ethics, looking at real life case studies when ambiguous situations where you can't tell at first viewing, is this morally correct or morally incorrect? Is this an ethical violation or is it not an ethical violation? The purpose of this session will introduce you to work through some case studies and show you how the Code of Ethics can be used as a decision-making tool. Until then, enjoy.